PAX Aus Online 2021. How are you all? I'm so happy to be here with you virtually with my colleagues Adam Bierstedt and Lauren Spohn. Hopefully some of you are returning from the panel that With a Terrible Fate gave yesterday on ethics in video game storytelling. We're really happy to be here with you today. Thank you for spending an hour of your weekend with us virtually. We wish we could be there in person, but we're going to make it worth your while all the same. For those of you who don't know With a Terrible Fate, we are a volunteer online publication dedicated just to analyzing the storytelling in video games. That's the one thing we do just because we love these stories so much and want to develop a more robust language to have better conversations about what makes them so great. We mostly do that in the form of long form written content, all of which you can find on withaterriblefate.com. But we also love coming out to conventions like this, whether in person or virtual, meeting like-minded gamers and talking about why these stories are so great, because at the end of the day, it really is about being able to share this medium that we love with other people who recognize how great it is. We're going to be talking today about kind of a meta level of what it is we typically do and what it is that all gamers do when talking about games, namely various ways to approach what we're going to be calling metagaming the story of games, or basically figuring out different modes of how to interpret them and make those stories meaningful in special and illuminating ways beyond just wondering about what the author intended or what constitutes the plot of the game. A couple of housekeeping things just about the special nature of the online aspect of this before we get started. We're really excited to actually be in the Discord channel with you, actually live as this is going on. The way that our presentations work is that we're basically going to talk at you for an hour about our views on this topic. So we hope you refrain from discussion as much as possible in Discord during that. But like I said, one of our favorite reasons for doing this is having those conversations with you after the fact. So we hope that you stick around, and we'll be in Discord to chat about any aspect of this panel or anything else video game storytelling that you might be interested in after we're done. We're also going to be taking advantage of Discord to actually give a little bit of better spoiler warnings than is usually possible in a presentation such as this. So we will let you know when we're about to start spoiling a game. If you are really interested in playing that game in the future and you want to tune out, that's cool. Keep an eye on Discord, because we will let you know in there when the spoilers are over, so you can jump back in without having missed more than just that spoiler-laden content. Finally, we are going to be trying out QR codes because of this wonderful recorded and online nature of this. So having been an online publication for really the better part of 6 years now, unbelievably, we have, like we're gesturing at in this picture on the cover slide, a pretty healthy library of content analyzing different games and what makes storytelling so great in the video game medium. So when relevant literature comes up in the course of our conversation, we're going to throw a QR code on the screen. If you're interested in reading more, just scan that sweet code with your phone. It'll take you to a relevant article that we hope you will enjoy. So without further ado, let's jump into this. And before we can think about metagaming video game stories, whatever the heck that means, right? Let's start a level back and ask just what metagaming is, right? Lots of gamers talk about the meta of their favorite games, but it's not always obvious what that means. For our purposes, we're thinking about, first you have a given video game object, right? So just a game and the way that it's presented and all of the things you can do with it. And then in terms of metagames, we're thinking about games that basically communities or singular players develop that might not be the normal way with which the game is engaged, but can constitute almost a different mode of play unto itself. So thinking about when you talk about the meta of a mobile game, for instance, in terms of the best characters and equipment to get through the current challenges in it, like Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, or when you think about the wild world of speedrunning, which takes a game like Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and makes use of things like glitches and anomalies in the code in order to get from the beginning to the end of the game in a matter of minutes or seconds, right? Or indeed something like nuzlocking in Pokemon, where you play through the game but impose rules on yourself to basically make the game harder and develop better relationships with the Pokemon you acquire in the game. These are all games that might not be encoded or expected within the base game, but players so interested can play these games with the base object and derive interesting new insights in the base game by virtue of doing that. That's what we want to suggest you can do with metagaming, the stories of video games. We oftentimes think about stories, especially in video games, I think, just as the plot, where there's a fact of the matter of what happened, and sometimes it's not obvious, so you can work to figure that out. But once you know the plot, all is said and done, right? We want to challenge that assumption for you over the course of the next hour, and basically argue that beyond thinking about the plot or just what the author meant to express, or what you felt when engaging with the game, there are actually different kinds of interpretation or metagames licensed by the text of a video game that can, just like metagaming in the gameplay ways we talked about, give you really interesting new insights on what is going on in that fiction. And to just set this up in terms of a framework, I think we can get to that intuition and get excited about thinking about different ways of metagaming video game stories by thinking about engagement with fictions like video games according to three different aspects that are at work, right? One is the text that represents that fiction and that story, where the fiction is really everything from the characters to the plot to things like the themes, or even in video games, the gameplay and player engagement. Those are all things that we're thinking about when we talk about story, right? So the text of the game just represents those aspects of it that are hard-coded into that base object, like we talked about. Then on the other end, we have the audience that is engaging with this work of fiction. And then in the middle, you have this really cool thing called interpretation, right? It seems like an afterthought, but the fact of the matter is, whenever you're engaging with a work of fiction, or indeed any text, in order to understand it and make sense of it at all, you're going to be interpreting it in one way or another. Even if your default interpretation is, I want to know the mere events of the plot and be able to understand that on the level of what happened factually within the fiction, that is still constituting an interpretive mode of engagement, right? And so what we want to suggest to you is that by zeroing in on different kinds of interpretation and different ways in which the audience can relate to the text, we can come up with different tools for understanding a game story that go beyond mere plot without veering into the realm of mere speculation that isn't grounded in the source text at all. Let me tell you a little bit about the roadmap for how we're going to do this. First, Adam is going to talk to you about different methods of interpretation, that middle section of how we actually engage with the game story and what the outcomes for those different modes of engagement can be. Then, because video games are interactive, I'm going to explore the really cool ways in which it can actually invite the audience into being a part of that interpretation in a way that doesn't happen in a novel or a film. And then finally, Lauren is going to go in the other direction and think about, once we have the various interpretations available to us of these texts, how can that inform who we are as people and indeed how we engage with the real world? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to get us started here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Aaron. I appreciate it. And we should be live there. So, welcome, PAX Aus. I hope you all are enjoying it so far. We've got a whole lot more to go through. In my section, we're going to be doing everyone's favorite thing, methodology. Hooray. But actually, it's going to be really cool. I'm really excited to bring this to you. So let's hop right in. I want to start with basically a single question. What does it actually mean to metagame a narrative? We've talked a little bit about it already, but on a basic level, like, what do we actually mean by that? As Aaron said, there are three parts that are relevant: the audience, the text of the game, and then the interpretation. The audience and the text are pretty intuitive. The audience interacts with the text causes an emotional response in the audience, so the two exist kind of interacting with each other directly. But interpretation fits not super clearly into this. To give an intuitive but wrong answer, let's spin up a scenario here. Imagine that you're meeting up with a friend, and over drinks, you kind of started talking about the last game you both played. So you share your experiences, you argue about some of the finer plot points, if there's a romance option, who the best romance option is, and then at the end agree, like, that's a really good game. That is an act of interpretation. Or you're reading something on Kotaku or IGN or With a Terrible Fate. You're not about to go boot up the game again to see what we're talking about. You'll probably decide if you agree or disagree based on your experience with the game and your memory of that. And before I personally started writing games analyses here on With a Terrible Fate and elsewhere, I projected that same process back onto analysts. When someone plays a game, they then think about it a lot, and then they create the interpretation. In other words, interpreting a game and making an argument about it occurs after the initial playthrough. In short, the interpretive metagame at first glance doesn't necessarily appear to be attached to the game, right? This is all super intuitive, but it feels like it's all after the fact. So different interpretations are methodologically similar. You play the game, you think about it, you create an interpretation. That makes it really hard to imagine different categories of what a metagame means. Like, how can a player participate if it's all something that occurs in your head long after the fact? Obviously, as I said explicitly earlier, this is in fact backwards. When we talk about your friend about a game, that's continuing a process that began the moment you picked up the controller. I aim to show you all over the next few minutes exactly how, while playing the game, you can also play an interpretive metagame. To do this, I'm going to be using Hollow Knight as a case study, so I'll let you know when spoilers start as we get into the actual interpretive categories, but I will be mentioning lore events and optional contents, so general spoiler warning for the main game and the Godhome DLC. So, let's start breaking down our metagame with an analogy: speedrunning. If we look at the speedrun.com page for Hollow Knight, there are 13 listed speedrun categories. You can see them all across the top and then down, each with 4 different subcategories. That's a massive 52 different run categories without listing meme categories like grub percent, where all you're doing is collecting the grubs. That's a lot of categories. And if you've watched any of these, you know they play totally differently. The any percent no major glitches route does some pretty funky skips, but the current any percent all glitches route involves a bizarre save slot glitch that gives you all the items right off the bat using a Godseeker save file type. So speedrunning is a super useful comparison for our metagame. We can actually model ours off of speedrunners. Here's a very rough breakdown of what things speedrunners might be doing during a run. They might abuse certain mechanics, like iframes, pogos, charm interactions, etc. They might have a route that breaks the normal route of the game, such as getting the early dream nail through the shade skip. They're paying attention to certain things. Attention is a resource, and so they may be focusing on their geo route, or how many hits they've dealt to a boss, or damage numbers for spells, all of that stuff. And it's really rare that a speedrunner has a run entirely exclusively in their head. They have a note sheet that they're referring to. So we can expand that out to paratexts or kind of side texts that are related to a game without being part of the game's code itself. In short, they are playing with a particular goal in mind. For speedruns, it's beat the game with certain extra restrictions as quickly as possible. We can do the same. We're broadly seeking to understand game stories, and so our categories will shape what goals we're looking towards. Throughout this talk, I'm going to outline 4 potential options to illustrate what I mean, and just how differently any given player will play in each category. Disclaimers before we hop in. First, I make no claims that this is exhaustive. There are theoretically infinite categories. I'm just listing a few to open the door of what's possible. If you think of another one, please feel free to let us know in the discussion section at the end of the panel. I really want to hear what you guys think. Secondly, these categories may look like they have similarities to Bartle's 4 types of players or other similar player psychology categories. This is purely coincidental. Each of you can do any of these categories right now. Well, not right now, because hopefully you're listening to me, but you know what I mean. If it's your first time or your 100th, all of these categories always remain viable to all players. So, without further ado, let's jump in. Spoilers start now. Category 1, all main plot. This is perhaps the most common interpretive category run in any video game. For lack of a better term, this is perhaps most players' default. It still is a totally valid interpretive category, though. I want to reiterate that a few times. This is not less valid for being the thing most people do first. Anyway, it's playing through the game along more or less the intended route, watching the cutscenes, and doing the main quest without significant sequence breaks. Players' engagements with mechanics will vary, but almost certainly not going to find every strange interaction. For example, like in Charms, I believe it's like Dung Defender and the Fluke Charm will create exploding dung bomb things. Anyway, it may not get the Dream No More ending where we kill the Radiants, and it probably won't find optional content like the Path of Pain or the White Defender. The focus is going to be on characters and cutscenes such as Hornet here, and the interpretive attention is on the characters interacted with. We probably also don't have a lot of paratext, maybe a walkthrough if you get stuck, but that's about it. As a result, the narrative is extremely present focused on the player avatar's actions. Hellenist in this category is clearly tragic, but largely is left mysterious. The tragedy of it, much less the very detailed timeline, remains unknown. Instead, our story focuses on what characters are doing right now. Once again, this is entirely fine. This is a complete narrative and interpretive experience and does not weaken that experience for remaining shrouded in mystery. Thematically, we may focus on dreams and the dreamers, but probably isn't dealing a whole lot deeper than that. Category 2, the deep lore. The second category is that of the lore expert. In short, this is a playthrough that is looking for everything that might develop the past of the game world. Item descriptions and synergies, dialogue, statues, anything and everything that explains how the world got to where it is when we walk in. Dark Souls is perhaps the most famous example of a game that has spawned lore-based analyses, but Mossbag and their videos have definitively proven that Hollow Knight is able to do it too. In this category of analytical playthrough, there's a lot happening. Mechanically, a player might be spending a lot of time experimenting with different charms, weapon upgrades, etc., to find potentially significant combinations. They're also, though, often going to do everything except what a quest asks them to do. For instance, when given the delicate flower and being asked to take that to the Queen's Garden, they may give it to the Elder Bug or to the Godseeker. Of course, doing the latter unlocks a unique ending to the game, so well played, Team Cherry, well played. This route is going to be all over the place, exploring every nook and cranny, poring over every bit of dialogue, in short, spending a lot of time in the game world looking around. Paratexts, the game might be stopping to take screenshots and notes, and when they're playing, they're probably trying to piece the story together in this grand narrative arc. So each moment of environmental storytelling fits into a broader narrative. The resulting interpretation is unsurprisingly very past-focused. The Pale King and the Radiance's war marks the centerpiece of the interpretation, and the game's present events mark the culmination of those two beings' endless strife. Thematically, the nature of soul and life in this world may be of particular note in Soul Sanctum and the Abyss, and in fact, the main character's own soullessness. But many of the currently living NPCs mark at best a footnote in Hellenist's grand tragedy. Category 3, the Environmentalist. This category, like the lore run, is going to be highly exploratory, but for totally different reasons. Aesthetics and emotions come first in this playthrough, and if the player stumbles into some distant, magnificent vista, they'll probably stop to enjoy the mood. Characters also heavily feature here, but not so much because of what they do, as because of who they are. So I've got here Quirrell, just sitting, vibing in the City of Tears, and enjoying that little moment. Mechanically, traversal mechanics are going to be really important in order to aid in exploration, e.g. trying to do the early Crystal Summit before you have the Monarch Wings. Attention here is being paid to music, aesthetics, and you're probably going to have screenshots, maybe the soundtrack playing if you don't like the specific songs, and otherwise note-taking to just enjoy this experience. The analytical interpretation created by this category might, like the first category, be focused on the here and now. However, it turns the lens away from the text of the game and towards the player. The player's reactions and emotional responses are likely to feature in this narrative in moments of beauty, triumph, sorrow, and defeat, which is why the grubs are very, very likely to feature. If you've played the game, you remember the final reward for finding them all. If you haven't, I will not spoil that one. Erin is going to talk more about how the player can be an entity within the game's text, but it's worth noting here that the avatar, which in a lore run, you may care a lot about being an empty shell, is imbued with emotion by the player. And once they're given emotion by that player, the avatar will start to make ethical decisions that genuinely affect the world around them, changing the future path of the world. an aspect of interpretation that a lore run really doesn't care about, but an environmentalist run absolutely does. Category 4, minimalist. The last category I'm going to propose here is the minimalist one. This takes a bit of explanation, so bear with me. This is essentially the narrative result of an any percent speedrun or a pacifist run. In short, what happens when large parts of the game world are just ignored? Mechanically, this requires total mastery not only of the intended mechanics, but of unintended ones like glitches. The route is going to be full of sequence breaks to avoid combat. One could imagine a few variants here. Focus on killing as few things as possible, killing no non-mandatory enemies, killing only bosses, or doing whatever as long as it's fast. It's actually even possible to avoid the first main act of the game. Unlocking Pantheon 5 and therefore finishing the game does not require killing the Dreamers. You can actually just kill the bosses before them, turn around and leave. So, what narrative is going to come out of this? Well, it's actually future focused, right? We reject everything that looks like a present narrative, everything that looks like a past narrative, and are entirely thinking about the future. If Hallownest is not effectively depopulated by a homicidal bug with a nail, will those people come back to sentience when absolute radiance or just the regular radiance is destroyed? What about if the Dreamers aren't obliterated? Will they wake up to re-guide Hallownest? And what about the Hollow Knight? In the super secret ending, the Hollow Knight survives. All of these entities still exist, unlike in any other playthrough. And while the game doesn't provide strong answers, only this style of playthrough even asks those questions. Most significantly, though, a different minimalist category might never have the player enter the abyss, but it fundamentally still rejects the Pale King. Where the Pale King ended untold lives, as every lore expert will tell you, in the abyss, the Avatar seeks in a minimalist interpretation, even in the face of plague and violence inflicted upon them, to preserve life and assert it as valuable. That radically reframes the interpretations of the lore category into a moral framework and rejects its necessity, something incredibly cool within a world and a narrative that largely is built up around violence. So, to wrap up, as I said earlier, this isn't comprehensive. I imagine there are lots of other categories of narrative interpretation present both in Hollow Knight and in other games, but I hope this has been illuminating as to the potential. If you take away one thing, playing the game in different ways generates meaningfully different but equally valid interpretations. Every category I described is supported by the game's text and is shaped by the player who is running that category. So when we say metagame throughout the rest of the presentation and in the future, we mean it entirely literally. It is fundamentally playing the game in discrete ways, and then as we'll see at the end, we can let those discrete ways of playing bounce against each other in communities beyond the game to create even more interpretations and an even broader impact on the world around us. So that's all I've got. Thanks so much for having me. I'll hand it back to Erin now to continue the panel.
Thank you, Adam. We have now, I hope you'll agree with me, a very robust understanding of what's going on in metagaming video game stories. And now I want to show you how video games can invite their players into those stories. So intuitively, of course, video games are an interactive medium. We love playing these games. We love being involved in them. But I want to spend my time during this presentation as a philosopher of video games who focuses mostly on the relationships between players and avatars, showing you a somewhat unusual way of thinking about what your role within a video game's fiction actually consists in, and showing you how that's not just something that's theoretically interesting, but like Adam said, with metagaming video game stories, can actually give you a really cool new perspective on these worlds, and in some cases lead to an appreciation for games that you might otherwise have written off, as was the case, in fact, for me with Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch, which we'll be talking about as a case study in how cool this way of thinking about player involvement in games can be. It starts with a pretty simple question that I think you'll agree with me is fairly intuitive. Given that games are interactive, it's natural to ask, okay, how do I, the player, the one interacting, fit into this story, right? And with that as our basic question and framework, I'm going to begin with the obvious answer to that question. Then I'm going to motivate some reasons to maybe not be satisfied with that obvious answer before giving you my preferred theory of what a player's role in video game fictions consists in, showing you how that can lead to a new understanding of a specific game, namely Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch. And then we're going to zoom out to think about how you can actually apply this when you're playing your own favorite games so that it can become, to use Adam's great framework, a new way of metagaming story that is grounded in the text, just like everything that he talked about. So when you're asking this question, the intuitive answer that I think leads many players not to think further about it is, well, you know, I, in many cases, actually see the world of these games through the eyes of the avatar. The actions that I'm inputting into my controller manifest primarily through the actions of the avatar. So it seems like my role within the fiction of the video game is just that of the avatar. So when I'm pushing buttons and controlling Corvo and Dishonored, as you see on this screen, my agency is exhausted just by whatever his agency is. That's very intuitive, and I think that's the way that a lot of gamers think about the way they're involved in games. But I want to make trouble for it with two puzzles for you to think about. The first is a problem of explanation, right? I think if we buy into this as the player's final mode of involvement in a video game, there are events within video game plots and stories that warrant explanation that we don't actually end up with the theoretical resources to explain. So consider, as a toy example, you know, say you're piloting the Dragonborn around Skyrim, going on adventures, doing whatever you do in Skyrim, and you happen upon this road that's occupied by monsters. They catch you by surprise. They kill the Dragonborn respawns a little ways back. So you, as the savvy player, have the Dragonborn go a different way the next time around. Well, it seems like, insofar as that's part of the game's story, it's worth asking the question, well, why did the Dragonborn go that different route rather than the route with the monsters? And it seems like that's a totally apt event for explanation within the game's story. But it doesn't seem like, if you're identifying the player with the avatar, you have the resources to explain why the avatar did what she did, because the avatar, by virtue of having died during the last run where she found the monsters, isn't going to have a recollection that monsters are along this other path and so it's worth avoiding. It seems like the right explanation has to do with the player having that knowledge. But if the player's knowledge and involvement in a video game just consists in what the avatar knows and what the avatar does, it doesn't seem like you can admit that knowledge of the monsters on the other path into the explanation. So we have this weird sense in which something that really obviously has a reason, an action by the avatar avoiding these monsters, can't be explained if you have this intuitive view of the player's involvement in a video game fiction just consisting in the avatar and what the avatar does. It gets worse when you think about video games whose stories centrally depend on differences between epistemic dispositions or things that the player knows versus things that the avatar knows or believes or desires, right? And I'm going to do a quick spoiler for Spec Ops: The Line, a famous example that video game analysts love to talk about because it's the perfect case of this, right? It's a game that's inspired by Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now. Before it, it features this Delta Force captain, Martin Walker, going through war-torn Dubai. As he experiences all the horrors of war, he's slowly driven insane and commits numerous atrocities. But the real thrust of what happens at the end of Spec Ops: The Line is that as Captain Walker is being indicted for all of the horrors that he's committed, the player also is being indicted, but not for the same things, because Walker, over the course of this game, remember, was being driven insane. He was in many ways a victim of this war in which he became involved, whereas the player from the outside is cold, calculating, stone cold sober, perfectly sane, and yet still deciding to enact the increasingly horrible actions of this person who's been driven beyond the pale of madness. That distinction between the avatar being insane and the player being sane is crucial to what's going on in terms of the theme of guilt and responsibility and violence in Spec Ops: The Line. But if you're saying that the player is just playing the role of the avatar by virtue of going through this game, again, it's not clear what what meaningful sense you can make of the player's involvement involving different knowledge or a different epistemic state than the avatars. So we have some problems, right? And if you want to read some more problems, here's that sweet QR code. I actually wrote a journal article explaining my own positive view and raising some more problems for the intuitive view. So check that out if you're interested. But for the sake of time here, I'm going to give you a sense of what my own preferred view is. It's less intuitive, but I think it allows us to avoid those problems and see a lot of video game stories in interesting, different ways. So I think rather than the player's fundamental involvement in a video game fiction consisting just in the avatar, rather, I think the role that the player is occupying is something more metaphysically foundational, kind of like you can imagine God making things happen within the world, as Michelangelo famously depicted in the creation of Adam, seen here, right? I think that the player plays the role of what I call the fictional player, which is this kind of godlike entity that recognizes all the things that are possible within a video game fiction and is able to make them actual. So a kind of agency, but something that is of an ontologically different kind than a character, like an avatar or an NPC, right? That seems less intuitive, but while it allows us to avoid those problems, it also allows us to get really cool new insights into games like Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch. If you're interested in reading and learning more about this, I wrote a much longer article and analysis of this, which you can access by scanning this sweet QR code seen here. But I choose to dwell briefly in this presentation on Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch, because it was a game that I initially was totally unwilling to play because I picked it up, I heard, oh, JRPG made in collaboration with Studio Ghibli. That sounds like it's going to be awesome. But while it felt very beautiful and polished, it also felt very childlike to me in the first place. And so I ended up actually walking away from it and putting it down for a series of months. And when I finally went through it and finished it, it was exactly this kind of less intuitive view of how I, as a player, am involved in the game that made me absolutely fall in love with it. And in fact, come to believe that its childlike veneer is part of what makes it a really compelling story for exactly adults to go through, right? So in broad strokes, Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch follows the journey of this avatar, Oliver, whom you see in the top left side of your screen. Following the death of his mother, he discovers this world parallel to his own, a fantasy world that's been taken over by this evil wizard named Shadar, whom you see on the top right-hand side of your screen. He's basically literally broken the hearts of everyone in that world, robbing them of various virtues in order to make them inert, unable to act. And Oliver is called on by, among other people, his kind of guide and a friend who comes from that world, Mr. Drippy, whom you see alongside him on the top left-hand side of the screen, to become a wizard and answer this call to defeat Shadar in what seems initially like a very paint-by-numbers JRPG story of traveling this fantasy world to defeat the big bad, right? It's hard for an adult to get into, though, in comparison with some other JRPG stories, because Oliver is a very vocally childlike protagonist, right? He's maybe 8 or 9 years old. I forget if there's an answer as to exactly how old he is in the game, but he is very much a child in a way that you can't write off as you can Link in Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time, for instance, because Link is silent. It's easy to impose your own views as a player over him, but Oliver's always talking about how, oh, I'm not a crybaby, or oh, I'm scared, and saying a lot of childlike things because he is a child, right? And so that's right in your face. It's right in your face in a world where, similar to something like Pokemon or even a more childlike rendition of Persona, every enemy you encounter is basically a friend waiting to happen, right? You can befriend them, literally bring them into your heart within the ontology of the game. And so as you journey through these tens of hours in this fantasy world, it starts to seem like you're just playing a game of make-believe with this kid, which can be fun for kids. But as an adult, having picked up this game and engaged with it, you find yourself wondering, like, oh, okay, what is really there for me? I'm having difficulty identifying with this avatar. And indeed, if you think that the player's involvement in a game just consists in occupying the role of the avatar, that's going to alienate you from it, right? But it turns out I think that alienation is intentional, right? Because as you start to unravel the totality of what's going on in this game, you start to learn a little bit more about this world and about the relationships beyond that of player with avatar. So central to Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch, is this notion of soulmates. There's the world that Oliver is from, and there's this parallel fantasy world. And in fact, for each person in one world, they have a soulmate in the other world to whom they are bound and for whom events that they experience or changes in their heart impact the other, right? This notion, I think, creates groundwork for understanding the player not as someone occupying the role of the avatar, but actually in a really interesting way as the soulmate of the true big bad in the game, not Shadar, but rather the eponymous White Witch, Cassiopeia, right? So as you go through this game, one of the really interesting twists that you discover in it is that Shadar, the wizard big bad, is actually the soulmate of Oliver. So they have a shared history and a shared influence on each other. And interestingly, they share not only characteristics in terms of who they are, but also functionally how they operate within the game. Oliver is, of course, the avatar, and Shadar has many avatar-like qualities. He gains different abilities as he goes through the game. He is explicitly defined as the executor of the White Witch's will. The White Witch, we learn, is this all-powerful kind of wizard and former queen who exists in this castle that literally overlooks the entire world of the game, and she exerts her will over this world through the proxy of Shadar, not unlike a player does with the avatar in the game, right? So Oliver and Shadar have these many similarities, with one glaring exception, or anti-parallel, in fact. Oliver is this beacon of childlike optimism, where Shadar is this pessimistic, beaten down, cynical kind of creature who is really used less as a character and more as an object. In fact, as many cynical players are apt to treat their avatars, right? Because while avatars can have robust and interesting characters, they also, at the end of the day, are the tools with which we engage video game stories, right? And the White Witch very clearly has this perspective towards Shadar, a perspective that we come to learn is really the fact of Cassiopeia, the White Witch, being made to grow up too fast, being thrust into this role of agency too quickly as a child, and being corrupted by these powers that adults around her and cynical councilmen basically enticed her to use in ways that were not consistent with her own childlike view, and that led her to become this monstrous cynic who was imposing Shadar upon the world, right? Not unlike many players might become cynical to the point where, as adults, in their pursuit of robust, interesting video game stories, their first impulse might be to turn away from something that has childlike optimism and a sincere character who just wants to befriend all of the putative enemies of this world, right? That similarity between the White Witch and the player, when you see the player as this kind of more metaphysically foundational god rather than just the source of agency for the avatar, or indeed the avatar himself, sets up a really interesting storytelling opportunity. Because as soon as you recognize your own reflection as a cynical adult player in the White Witch, by virtue of the game's ontology and this notion of soulmates, where healing one soul can heal its mate, you are able to have an opportunity within the context of this fiction to heal yourself of your own cynicism by defeating the White Witch and saving her from her cynicism, and literally reuniting her with her inner child who guides you throughout the game and encourages you to save her. Once you have this perspective, not only are you able to get a lot out of this game as an adult player, but a lot of aspects of the game that might otherwise seem weird or not make sense suddenly snap into focus as really meaningful, right? One of the very weird things about this game that's hard for people to make sense of is, after you have this whole satisfying narrative arc of confronting Shadar and defeating him and saving his soul, etc., etc., there's a final cinematic. It seems like the game is going to wrap up, and then the White Witch's voice booms out of the sky at this moment when Oliver is waving goodbye to his friends, and she basically casts this spell that turns all of the wonderful characters you've come to know and love over the course of this game into mindless zombies and mere enemies with no character, saying basically that the White Witch has the right to restart this world at will because it exists for her manipulation, and she can do whatever she wants to it. what she wants to it, excuse me. It's that notion of what is known in the game as the forbidden spell or mana, this ability to restart the world, that creates yet another parallel between the White Witch and the player. Because if you think about what the idea of New Game Plus consists in, where you're able to restart a game story for your mere entertainment, undoing all of the progress and satisfying narrative arcs that characters have had, it seems a lot like you as the player are saying you have the right to do whatever you want to this world, which would be incomplete without you, for your own entertainment, right? And the game is showing you that maybe there's something perverse about that. In fact, maybe there's a sense in which it is imposing something unnatural and unethical upon this world, just as the White Witch seems to be unethically extending the story for her own pleasure in a way that's not consistent with the satisfaction of the narrative arc. And once you see it in this way, coming to heal the White Witch also comes to heal the player of that cynicism in a way that the game reinforces by actually not offering a New Game Plus perspective. Instead, once you're able to reunite Cassiopeia with her inner child and heal her, the end of the game, instead of allowing you to reset, actually just directs you to enjoy everything this world has to offer, exactly like the healed Cassiopeia says that she wants to do, right? And it's in being able to explore that world without resetting it and coming to know the characters even better that you're able to recognize not only the cynicism that drew you away from the game in the first place, but also ultimately the value of this world, and reconnect you with perhaps many of the optimistic modes of engagement that drew you to games as a child when you were thinking of them less as works of fiction to explore and analyze, as we've been talking about so far, and more as these robust games of make-believe where you can really fall in love with the characters and appreciate them just intrinsically on their own terms. Something that for me wouldn't have been possible without thinking about this perspective of player involvement in video game fictions. If you want to engage in this with your own games, even just as an exploratory exercise, I think it can be a lot of fun. It's as simple as asking questions like, as you're playing a game, okay, how does agency in this world work? And what is my involvement in the story beyond just the conduit of the avatar? And to the extent that we're able to do different things, or in fact want different things for this world, what does that tension or dissonance tell me about my own involvement in the game, and indeed about its story more broadly? When you start thinking about games in this way, it can lead you to still appreciate the characters and the plot of the story on its own terms, but also think a lot about what might otherwise be written off as framing devices as centrally important to the story. Things like the notion of the New Game Plus mechanic that I talked about in Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch, or in something like Final Fantasy IX, things that might seem like framing motifs such as the theatricality of it as actually key to understanding the overall arc of the story. And if you're interested in learning more about that, scan that sweet QR code. We have a whole other article about that. So thank you for exploring this notion of player involvement in video game stories with me. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren for the final third of this presentation. Thank you.
Awesome, Aaron. Thank you so much. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and, as soon as you stop, share my screen here. So out of the other many big takeaways that we hope that you guys leave this panel with, remember that all QR codes are sweet. So that's one thing to remember. Okay, so great. We have talked about what metagames are, and we've talked about the kind of we get from thinking about metagames in terms of understanding our own relationship to avatars and to games themes more broadly. Now I want to zoom out and ask, how do we think about game narratives in cultural context? Namely, in our sort of the way that game narratives affect us personally, and also how we think about games on the macro level of what it means for culture more broadly, to have games in the mix of film and books and TV and all these other media of storytelling. So first, a helpful way to sort of think about what I'm going to talk about is in this series of 3 images here. Right in the middle, we have the title screen from Legend of Zelda Breath in the Wild, right? And to the right, we have a very famous image associated with the Romantic movement, the 1818 painting, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. And then to the left of the Breath of the Wild image, you have me standing atop Mount Fuji after I bullet hiked it a couple summers ago. Would not recommend unless you have like 5 of the Red Bulls that Aaron is currently drinking, because we hiked through the night and got to the top right in time for sunrise. But what I'm trying to get at here with this series of images is that as I was taking this picture at the top of Mount Fuji, or asking my friend to take it, I had in mind both the image from Breath of the Wild and the painting of Wonder Above the Sea of Fog. And as I was thinking about this, I was understanding my own adventure in terms of being a kind of modern day hero of time, as well as a kind of romantic wanderer in search of adventure, in search of hard quests, and in search of new insights. And so there's a way in which both of these different ways of understanding my experience colored the crazy, crazy hike that I was having on Mount Fuji. So kind of keep that in mind. That will be an operating theme of this part of the talk, namely how games can inform our cultural understanding and our personal understanding of ourselves. But first, a polemic. Why is it important to think about this now? Last month, Tyler Cohen, an economist at Georgetown, wrote this horrific op-ed saying that gaming will change humanity as we know it. Okay, Cohen spends a lot of time reading books and obviously not a lot of time playing video games, because he does nothing to distinguish the kinds of games that he's talking about. And it's fairly obvious that this man has never played a video game in his life. The thrust of his argument is that gaming will go on to change humanity. Games are self-referential and basically comprise closed systems that have no frame of reference outside their own worlds. And this, as a consequence, is bad for culture. Well, that's actually a QR code that's not sweet. So if you have to like rage read, scan it, but I would much rather you scan this QR code here, which is Aaron's point-by-point sort of counter argument to all of Cohen's claims. And I think the key that I want to draw out here is this quote here highlighted. Ultimately, we'll see that gaming indeed already has changed humanity in positive and exciting ways. What we need to establish here is the past participle has already changed humanity. In 2020, gaming was a $179 billion industry that was bigger than the global film industry and American sports combined. Okay, this is not a cultural change that's on the horizon, as Cohen seemed to suggest it would be. It's already here. Now, the question is, what is the consequence for cultural anthropology when we think about storytelling in a broader context? What does it mean now that so much of our narrative consumption is found in games? And that's where I want to focus on the second half of Aaron's quote here, positive and exciting. There are a lot of ways we can think about this, and here's just one. Namely, the claim that video game narratives are new cultural myths. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to dive into what is a cultural myth, and then the 3 reasons I give here for why we should think about game stories as an example of this. Namely, game narratives cross and transcend different types of media, which makes them a new cultural codex that can be used for all kinds of communication. Second, game narratives are a modern form of self-fashioning, of coming to understand both ourselves and our experiences in reference to this cultural language. And then finally, these shared modes of self and cultural understanding can help us create story-centered communities outside of the game world. So let's jump in. First of all, what is a cultural myth? For better or for worse, I'm going to take you back to my freshman year of college when I was sitting in a lecture hall listening to Stephen Greenblatt give a lecture on Hamlet. Professor Greenblatt is one of the world's foremost critics on Shakespeare. And the first thing that he asked my class in this lecture was, what is Hamlet? And no one could answer him. And the point he was trying to make is this: is Hamlet a play? Is it this folio written by Shakespeare at the end of the 16th century? Is it new movie by David Tennant? Is it a film by, scored by Hans Zimmer starring lions? Is it anything by Kenneth Branagh? I certainly hope not, right? The point is, this is a story that has transcended its original meaning. You can say Hamlet, or, my boyfriend, my cousin is acting like Hamlet these days. And everyone is going to know what you mean. Oh, he's probably moody. He's probably not able to make any kind of decision. Maybe he's soliloquizing on his Twitter feed or something. Who knows? But the point is, this is a story that, because it's escaped its original medium, has become a kind of shared language by which we can understand different events in our culture, and by which we can draw continuously to tell new stories that sort of draw us together in a common lingo and a common conversation today. So I want to make the case, focusing particularly on the Legend of Zelda games, that game narratives have indeed already become a new kind of cultural myth. We can see here in just sort of a panorama of different images how, in the case of the Legend of Zelda stories, we're already seeing a transcendence of the original media. Take Ocarina of Time, for example. We have on the far left of the screen fan fiction that's replacing the setting of Hyrule as a university where Link is a jock and Zelda is a scholar. One thinks of High School Musical, just replaced with Zelda characters. We have a live concert with multimedia scenes in the background. We have manga. We have a terrible television show that no one should ever watch, academic literature, and more paratextual material. The point here is that the language of the narrative of Ocarina of Time has transcended the N64 game, and it's become a kind of common lingo by which people can drag different parts of what this narrative is and recreate it, refashion it in all these different ways. Second of all, we want to talk about what this means, what this kind of multimedia narrative means for the way that we understand our own self-identities. Here, I'm going to go back to Stephen Greenblatt. So Greenblatt's sort of theory that came out early in his career is something called Renaissance self-fashioning. And what he means by this is, way back in the Renaissance, right, a lot of noble people in particular would have this kind of two-way interaction with the arts that they consumed. Namely, they would see in plays and portraiture and in icons a certain way of acting, a certain way of dressing, and would imitate those actions or norms in their own lives. And conversely, the kind of art that was produced would in turn imitate the kind of habits that these people had adopted from the art they had seen. So you can see how there's a kind of cycle here of people not only being influenced by the arts they consume, but also giving shape to those arts as they sort of start to adopt the habits they've seen projected there. So I want to say that similarly, game narratives are becoming a way for cultures not only to capture the norms, values, and habits that are already live among people, but also a way of reflecting and refracting back those same kinds of norms and values. So we can see this in something like Ocarina of Time, where Dan Hughes, one of our other With a Terrible Fate Analyst, has written a really great article drawing out some of the Shinto themes in Ocarina of Time, namely how this game incorporates, challenges, and also reflects different values of Japanese culture. Sweet QR code, definitely check that one out. In the US, we can see the same thing happening in something like Assassin's Creed, which is Assassin's Creed 3, like going back to the founding of the United States and trying to understand like what would it look like to actually participate in this, where are the moral gray areas that seem to be written out of history books. Then fast forward into a kind of post-apocalyptic Boston. What does it look like when American values are suddenly rotting on the streets? You know, what is a nation that's sort of broken post-atomic fallout? What does that look like? What does it mean to be an American then? And then for a more sort of contemporary look at things, you can see a kind of, maybe not satire, but definitely an exploration of a lot of cultural assumptions and values in something like Grand Theft Auto, and then Animal Crossing with this sort of fixation on consumption and development that some people have called a kind of materialist critique of late stage capitalism. So in all of these cases, we're seeing game worlds as ways of capturing and reflecting back to us the sort of values that by virtue of the culture that we live in, we swim in every day and have no doubt adopted to some degree ourselves. There's another way in which video games are kind of self-fashioning, namely as a form of education. A personal example here, I think that something like Ocarina of Time teaches you how to network really, really well. And this is not a way of like turning this into a utilitarian argument, far from it. I think it helps you realize that a lot of opportunity and a lot of chances to develop good relationships with people come from figuring out what they need by talking to them and then helping them out, whether it's putting all of their kakus back in the cage or back in the fence to get a ruby or something. You can see how, I know in my own life, for instance, I work at a building where I pass a security guard going in every day, and this man's name is Jim. And at first, Jim was kind of unfriendly, gave me the cold shoulder. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to talk to Jim and figure out what Jim likes. So after a while, first we started talking about the music, playing in the lobby. Then I brought in some cookies one day and tried to offer him one. And he said, oh, no, you know, I don't eat flour. And so in my own mind, that line, I don't eat flour, showed up like the red text that you see when you're talking to people at Ocarina of Time. So next time I went in, I gave him a baked good that had no flour in it. And suddenly Jim is friendly to me now every time I walk into the building. So small case in which you can see how the habits you start to develop playing something like Ocarina of Time can help you in the real world in your interactions with people. And then a final way that video games can become a kind of self-fashioning is through what I like to call a kind of multi-dimensional autobiographical memory. And so for this, if you're interested in learning more, check out the article we have on the website that I wrote last year. The idea behind this is that certain sensory inputs in the game stories that we experience key us in to particular memories that we have associated with those inputs. And our experience in the present, sort of hearing these sensory or getting these sensory inputs, is colored by the memory we have of playing the game and the vicarious memory we have as the avatar within the game. So in my case, every time I hear the opening theme of the Wind Waker, I'm transported back to childhood when I would play this game. And I'm transported back to this time that Link and I both seemed to share at the outset of an adventure. And for me, after I graduated high school, I played the final salvo at the end of the Wind Waker when Link sets off into the sunset to go begin a new journey. And for me, it was a way of kind of feeling again like a modern day hero of time. And suddenly I was recalling childhood. I was also recalling Link, sort of his own childhood. And through that, I had a way of deepening and coloring and better understanding and processing my own experience. So this is sort of self-fashioning at its most clear. And there are exciting ways in which this kind of association of game story and sensory input, in my case, it was music, actually enriched my life and helped me make sense of my experiences in a way I couldn't have otherwise. Finally, I want to talk about what the result of all of these different ways that games impact our personal stories have on us as we come together in community outside the world of games. Namely, they help us create story-centered groups of friends. We see this in cosplay, we see this in social media, and I, for one, always have a Legend of Zelda sticker on the back of my laptop, and you wouldn't believe the number of complete strangers in coffee shops and cafeterias who come up and start talking to me about Zelda because of this laptop sticker. And what's interesting about this is as soon as I connect with this person, we have immediately a shared experience that goes far beyond the number of hours that it would take to watch a TV show or even read a book. It's, in many cases, scores of hours of shared experience that at the same time, we've both walked through the same world in very different ways. So it's a perfect meeting place of common ground with enough different experience of that common ground to make for really fruitful and interesting conversation. And so far from being the kind of self-contained world that an outside critic like Cohen would say they are, game stories actually open up the world for a lot of interaction and a lot of community building outside the media of games. So as a meta point about our meta conversation today, this is exactly what we're doing online, right? 100% across the world, we're coming together because we all have this shared experience and this shared love of game stories to think more critically about what it means to really think hard and think productively and think in a very rich way about these stories. And as a result, we get to meet awesome people like you. So thank you for being a part of it. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right, PAX Aus, with that, I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed this. If nothing else, I hope it's encouraged you to think about the way in which you engage video game stories in new ways, maybe try out a new way of metagaming it. And we wanted to close just by raising a few more questions, some of many. Once you open this Pandora's box, there are so many avenues you can go down. So take a screenshot of this, read them through at your leisure. If you want to talk about these things or any aspect of the presentations or just your favorite aspects of what makes video game stories so cool, we will be hanging out in Discord. We would love to hear from you. And as always, you can find all of our work at withtheterriblefate.com. And thank you again. Hope to see you in the chat and to see you next year.